In the harsh Wyoming wilderness, a broken cowboy splits firewood with hands that shake more from shame than cold. Bo Carter has nothing left but his stubborn pride and a one-room cabin that couldn't keep a mail-order bride for more than an hour. She took one look at his meager life and rode away without a backward glance, leaving him to face another winter alone with his ghosts and regrets. But when Rose Ellington returns through the snow-heavy pines, she's not the same woman who fled. Desperate and nowhere else to turn, she's willing to accept the corner of his cabin and his cold shoulder. What she doesn't expect is to see past the rough exterior to the gentle soul beneath. A man who talks to stray cats and works himself raw just to prove he's worth something. Will two damaged hearts find healing in each other's brokenness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The axe bit deep into the frozen pine, sending splinters across the snow like scattered dreams. Bo Carter straightened his aching back and wiped the sweat from his brow despite the bitter cold that turned his breath to clouds. Each swing of the axe was measured, deliberate, a rhythm that had kept him sane through 3 months of Wyoming winter and 20 years of trying to forget what he'd seen in places most folks couldn't pronounce. His cabin sat hunched against the hillside like a wounded animal seeking shelter. One room, a stone chimney that drew poorly, and windows so small they barely let in enough light to read by. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every log chinked with his own hands, every nail driven with purpose. The place where a mail-order bride named Rose Ellington had taken one look around, pressed her lips into a thin line, and walked right back out to the wagon that brought her. That was 4 months ago. Bo still woke some mornings expecting to see. Her yellow hair, catching the dawn light through the window, still caught himself setting 2 cups instead of 1 when he made his coffee. Fool thing to do, expecting a woman raised in Philadelphia comfort to settle for a life that barely qualified. As living, the worn leather journal tucked inside his coat pocket, pressed against his ribs with each swing of the axe. He'd been writing in it since the war. Thoughts too heavy for speaking aloud, observations about the way morning light fell across snow, or how the wind sounded different when it carried the promise of a storm. His handwriting had grown steadier over the years, the words flowing easier when there was no one around to judge them. Rose hadn't known about the journal. Hell, she hadn't known much of anything about him except what the marriage broker had written in his letters. Bo Carter, age 34, owns land in Wyoming territory, seeks companionship, clean, honest work. What the letters hadn't mentioned were the nightmares that still woke him sweating, or the way his hands sometimes shook when he heard certain sounds, or how the townspeople in Clearwater whispered about the man who'd ridden into their valley, with mud on his boots and ghosts in his eyes. The rumors had followed him from Colorado, stories that grew in the telling until he was painted as everything from a deserter to an outlaw. None of it true. But truth had a way of getting lost when people needed someone to blame for their troubles. A missing horse here, a broken fence there, and suddenly Bo Carter was the convenient answer to every unsolved mystery in 3 counties. He set down the axe and gathered an armload of split wood, the pieces fitting together in his arms like old friends. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. A narrow bed pushed against one wall, a table he'd built from salvaged lumber, 2 chairs that didn't match. The stone fireplace dominated the room, its hearth blackened from years of faithful service. Rose had looked at it all and seen poverty. Bo saw peace. The coffee pot sat on the wood stove, its contents long cold. He'd made it strong this morning, the way his sergeant used to brew it over campaign fires when they were tracking Confederate. Supply lines through Tennessee mountains. Some habits died hard, and the ritual of morning coffee was one he refused to abandon. It connected him to simpler times, when his biggest worry was whether the enemy would find their camp before dawn. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters he'd reinforced last autumn. Wyoming winters were unforgiving to the unprepared, but Bo had learned to read the signs. The way the clouds gathered over the Medicine Bow Range, how the air itself seemed to thicken before a storm. These mountains had become his refuge, their harsh beauty matching something inside him that city folks would never understand. He pulled out the journal and opened it to a fresh page. The leather cover soft from handling. His pencil moved across, the paper in careful strokes, recording the day's observations. February 15th, snow falling steady since before dawn. The old mare's getting restless. Storm coming by evening. Cut enough wood to last 3 days if the wind doesn't blow too hard. Then he paused, pencil hovering over the page. What he wrote next, he'd never spoken aloud to another living soul. Still think about her sometimes. Rose, wonder if she made it back to Philadelphia safe, if she found herself a man with better prospects and a house that doesn't leak when the snow melts. Can't blame her for leaving. This place, this life. It's not what any woman should have to settle for, but there are moments when the sun hits the snow just right, or when that old tomcat comes around looking for scraps, that I think maybe it's enough. Maybe I'm enough, even if nobody else sees it that way. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound in the cabin until a soft knock at the door made him freeze. Nobody came calling in weather like this. Nobody came calling at all if he was. Being honest. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, and his nearest neighbor was 5 miles through rough country. Bo closed the journal and slipped it back into his coat. His hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt, old habits from days when unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. He opened the door to find Rose Ellington standing on his threshold, snowflakes clinging to her dark coat like scattered stars. She looked thinner than he remembered, her cheeks hollow and her eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. A single carpet bag sat at her feet, everything she owned in the world reduced to what could fit in one worn leather satchel. Bo. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the sound of it hitting him like a physical blow. He stood there in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. Rose Ellington, the woman who'd walked out of his life without a backward glance, was standing in the snow asking for shelter. She looked like she'd been traveling hard, her dress wrinkled beneath the heavy coat, her hair escaping from its pins. In wind-blown strands, Rose. He managed her name, nothing more. I know I have no right to ask, she began, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. But I've got nowhere else to go. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Bo's pride warred with something deeper, the part of him that had never stopped hoping she might come back, even as he'd convinced himself she was better off without him. He stepped aside without speaking, and Rose picked up her bag and crossed the threshold into the warmth of the cabin. She stood just inside the door, taking in the familiar space with eyes that seemed to see it differently now. The sparse furnishings, the neat arrangement of his few possessions, the way the firelight painted everything in shades of gold and amber. When she'd left, this place had seemed like a prison. Now it felt like sanctuary. You can take the bed, Bo said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. I'll make do with the floor. Rose shook her head. The corner will be fine. I don't want to put you out any more than I already have. They stood there in awkward silence, two people who'd shared the most intimate of plans, marriage, a life together. Now strangers again. Bo noticed the way Rose kept her hands clasped in front of her, how she avoided meeting his eyes directly. Something had happened to her in the months since she'd left, something that had driven her back to the last place on earth she'd wanted to be. Coffee's cold, he offered, nodding toward the pot on the stove. But I can make fresh. That would. Be kind. The formality in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. They were being polite, careful, dancing around the truth of what her return meant. Bo busied himself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. The familiar ritual grounded him, measuring the grounds, stoking the fire, finding the rhythm that had carried him through countless mornings alone. Rose removed her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. Underneath, her dress was faded but clean, mended in places with careful stitches. She'd always been handy with a needle, he remembered. It was one of the few practical skills she'd mentioned in her letters, back when they were still strangers. Planning a future together through carefully worded correspondence. "Storm's coming," Bo said, nodding toward the window where snow was beginning to fall harder. "Might be here for a few days." "I won't be any trouble," Rose replied quickly. "I can pay for my keep. I've got a little money saved." The offer stung more than it should have. "Keep your money. Nobody pays rent for shelter from a storm." She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture so familiar it made Bo's chest tighten. He'd seen her do the same thing that first day when she'd stepped out of the wagon and gotten her first look at the life he was offering. The difference was, then she'd been protecting herself from disappointment. Now she was protecting herself from something else entirely. The coffee began to boil, filling the silence with its familiar bubbling. Bo poured 2 cups and handed one to Rose, their fingers brushing for just a moment as she took it. The contact was electric, a reminder of all the ways they'd planned to know each other that had never come to pass. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. Bo settled into the chair across from her, cradling his own cup. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past in white spirals. They were trapped together by the weather, 2 people with too much history and not enough words to bridge the gap between what had been and what was. As the storm began in earnest, Bo found himself stealing glances at Rose's face in the firelight, wondering what had brought her back to his door and whether this time maybe she might choose to stay. The storm hit with the fury of something alive and angry. By nightfall, the wind was howling around the cabin like a pack of wolves, driving snow so hard against the windows that the glass shook in its frames. Bo had banked the fire high and moved his bedroll to the floor near the hearth, leaving Rose the narrow bed that suddenly seemed too small for the space between them. She hadn't slept. He could tell by the way she lay too still, her breathing too controlled. 3 times during the night she'd made small sounds. Not quite cries, but close enough to make Bo's hands clench in the darkness. Whatever had driven her back to his, Duda was following her into her dreams. When dawn finally came, grey and muted through the storm-heavy sky, Bo found Rose sitting at the table with a pile of papers spread before her. Letters, by the look of them, written in a man's bold hand. She was feeding them one by one into the fire, watching the flames consume what looked like months of correspondence. "Morning," Bo said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Rose looked up, and in the pale light he could see the exhaustion etched into her features. "I hope you don't mind. I needed to get rid of some things." He nodded toward the coffee pot. "Want some? Please." As he prepared the morning coffee, Bo watched Rose continue her methodical destruction of the letters. Each piece of paper curled and blackened in the flames, releasing secrets into smoke. When she came to what looked like a photograph, she hesitated, her hand trembling slightly before she fed it to the fire as well. The torn edges caught first, the flames eating inward toward the center, where Bo caught a glimpse of 2 figures. Rose, in a white dress, standing beside a man whose face disappeared into ash before Bo could make out his features. A wedding photograph that had never seen a wedding. His name was Marcus Whitfield, Rose said suddenly, as if the burning photograph had released the words from some locked place inside her. "I was supposed to marry him last September." Bo set her coffee cup down carefully, not trusting his hands, to remain steady. "What happened?" Rose stared into the fire, where the last of the photograph was dissolving into orange embers. "I found out what kind of man he really was, what he expected from a wife." The way she said it made Bo's jaw tighten. He'd known men like that during the war, men who mistook power for strength, who thought their rank gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. "Did he hurt you?" "Not the way you're thinking." Rose wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, using its warmth to steady herself. "Marcus is, refined, sophisticated. He doesn't use his fists when words can do more damage. He has ways of making you feel small, worthless, Like you should be grateful for his attention even when it feels like drowning. Bo settled into the chair across from her, giving her space to continue, or not, as she chose. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving fresh snow against the windows with renewed fury. I tried to leave him 3 times, Rose continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Each time he found me, brought me back, said he forgave me, that it was just wedding nerves. The last time, she paused, touching her throat in an unconscious gesture. The last time I realized he was never going to let me go. Not alive. The words hit Bo like physical blows. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize the signs, the way fear could carve itself into someone's posture, their voice, the spaces between their words. So you came here. I remembered your advertisement, the one that brought us together the first time. Rose managed a weak smile. Honest work, you said. Clean living. It sounded like the furthest thing from Marcus's world that I could imagine. And when you got here, Rose's smile faded. I took one look at this place and panicked. It was so different from everything I knew. Rough, simple. I thought it meant you were rough and simple too. I was so stupid, Bo. So blind. You weren't stupid, Bo said firmly. You were scared. There's a difference. A gust of wind rattled the cabin so hard that snow sifted down from the roof beams. Rose looked up nervously, and Bo followed her gaze to where ice was beginning to form along the edges of the window frames. This storm's not letting up any time. Soon, he observed, could be here for days. The observation hung between them with all its implications. They were trapped together, no way out until the weather broke. But instead of the panic Bo expected to see in Rose's eyes, he found something else. Relief, maybe, or resignation. I'm glad, she said quietly. For the first time in months, I know exactly where I am, and that no one can reach me here. As if, summoned by her words, a sharp crack echoed through the cabin. Bo was on his feet instantly, moving toward the sound. The wind had torn one of the shutters loose, and it was banging against the side of the cabin with each gust. If he didn't secure it soon, the whole thing would tear free and take part of the window frame with it. I need to fix that before it gets worse, he told Rose, already reaching for his coat. In this weather. Bo, you'll freeze. Won't take long. Just need to get it secured. But when he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked him backward. The storm had intensified beyond anything he'd seen in 3 years of Wyoming winters. Snow was falling so thick he could barely see the woodpile 10 feet away, and the temperature had dropped until each breath felt like swallowing ice. Bo fought his way around the side of the cabin, rope in hand, but the wind was too strong and the shutter too damaged to repair properly. As he struggled with the frozen hardware, a particularly violent gust caught the loose shutter and sent it spinning into the darkness. The sound of splintering wood told him it had found something solid to hit. When he finally made it back inside, Rose was waiting with a towel and a look of profound relief. Thank God. I thought the wind was going to take you too. Shutter's gone, Bo reported, shaking snow from his coat. But the window's intact. We'll have to ride it out. As he spoke, another crack echoed through the cabin, this one from overhead. They both looked up to see a thin line of daylight showing between 2 of the roof beams. The storm was testing every weakness in the cabin's construction, probing for ways to get inside. Is it going to hold? Rose asked. Bo studied the roofline, calculating the weight of accumulated snow, the age of the timbers, the stress points where decades of weather had taken their toll. Should, he said, though he wasn't entirely certain. Built her to last. But as the day wore on, the cabin groaned and settled under the storm's assault. Ice formed along the walls, where cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking. The fire struggled against downdrafts that sent smoke curling back into the room. And through it all, Rose and Bo found themselves drawn closer together by necessity. When the temperature inside began to drop despite the fire, Rose moved her chair nearer to the hearth. When ice began forming on the inside of the windows, Bo hung blankets across them for extra insulation. Each small crisis required cooperation, communication, the kind of partnership that had been theoretical in their correspondence but was becoming achingly real in the face of survival. "Tell me about the war," Rose said during a lull in the wind. "In your letters, you only said you served. Nothing more." Bo poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Not much to tell that's worth hearing." "I think there is." He looked at her across the firelight, this woman who'd seen enough of violence in her own life to understand its shadows. Maybe that's why he found himself talking, telling her about Tennessee mountains and night raids, about friends lost to bullets and disease, about the way some men came home and others just came back. "I was a scout," he said finally, "spent most of the war behind enemy lines gathering intelligence, got good at being invisible, at reading people, at staying alive when everything around me was dying." "Is that why the townspeople are afraid of you?" The question caught him off guard. "They tell you that." "They didn't have to. I saw how they looked at you when we went to town that day, like you were something dangerous they couldn't quite figure out." Bo was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth to share. "There was an incident in Colorado. A man died. Some people thought I was responsible. Were you?" "No." The word came out harder than he intended, but the truth doesn't always matter when people need someone to blame. Rose nodded slowly, and Bo realized she understood that particular truth better than most. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled between them. And for the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep, Bo allowed himself to hope that maybe this time Rose was seeing him clearly. As night fell and the temperature continued to drop, they moved their bedrolls closer to the fire. The cabin's single room had never felt smaller, yet somehow the forced intimacy didn't feel threatening. Instead, it felt like a cocoon, a small, warm space carved out of the hostile world where two damaged people could begin the careful work of trust. "Bo?" Rose's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for not asking questions, for not making me justify why I'm here." He turned toward her voice, though he could barely make out her shape in the dim firelight. "Everyone deserves a place to weather the storm, Rose. Everyone." Outside, the wind howled its fury at the mountains and the valley and the small cabin that refused to surrender to its rage. Inside, two people who'd given up on second chances began to discover that sometimes the storm brings exactly what you need, even when it's the last thing you expected. The storm broke on the third day, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of snow so deep it reached the cabin's windows. Bo woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the gaps in the blankets they'd hung for warmth, and the blessed silence that comes after nature has exhausted its fury. Rose was already awake, sitting by the window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the light dance across the pristine landscape. She'd braided her hair back from her face, and in the morning light she looked younger somehow, less burdened by whatever shadows had driven her back to his door. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said without turning around. Bo joined her at the window, pulling aside the makeshift curtain to get a better look. The world outside looked like something from a fairy tale. Trees bent under the weight of snow, their branches creating intricate patterns against the brilliant blue sky. His breath fogged the glass as he spoke. "Beautiful and deadly. That's Wyoming for you. How do we get out?" Carefully, Bo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his father's old pocket watch, its brass case worn smooth from decades of handling. The timepiece had stopped working years ago, but Bo still carried it, a reminder of time's passage and the importance of making each moment count. "Snow this deep, we'll need to dig our way to the woodpile and the privy. After that, we wait for it to settle some before trying to get to town." Rose nodded, accepting the reality of their continued isolation without complaint. "What can I do to help?" The question surprised him. The Rose who'd left 4 months ago hadn't shown much interest in the practical demands of frontier life. But something had changed in her during those months away, something that made her willing to roll up her sleeves and work alongside him instead of waiting to be taken care of. "You sure you want to? This isn't Philadelphia work, I'm sure." Bo handed her his heaviest coat. "Then let's get started." They spent the morning digging pathways through snow that came up to Bo's chest in places. Rose worked without complaint, her cheeks growing red from the cold, but her determination never wavering. She learned quickly how to use the shovel efficiently, how to lift with her legs instead of her back, how to read the snow's texture to know where it would be stable and where it might collapse. When they finally carved a path to the woodpile, Rose insisted on helping to carry the split logs back to the cabin. Bo watched her navigate the narrow trail they'd created, her arms full of firewood, her steps sure despite the treacherous footing. This wasn't the same woman who'd taken one look at his rough life and fled. This was someone who'd learned the value of shelter, of warmth, of the simple satisfaction that comes from honest work. "You're different," he said as they stacked the wood near the fireplace. "So are you." Rose brushed snow from her sleeves. 4 months ago, you barely said 10 words to me. Now you're actually talking." Bo considered that, recognizing the truth in it. Maybe having someone to talk to makes a difference. Maybe it does. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Bo would check the weather and plan their outdoor work, while Rose organized the cabin's interior with an efficiency that impressed him. She found ways to make the small space more comfortable, rearranging the furniture to create better conversation areas, mending his clothes with careful stitches, even attempting to cook meals that went beyond Bo's usual fare of beans and hardtack. Her first attempt at making biscuits was a disaster that left them both laughing as they tried to choke down what Rose declared edible rocks. But she persisted, asking Bo about his mother's recipes, experimenting with the limited ingredients available until she produced something that actually resembled food. "Where did you learn to be so stubborn?" Bo asked one evening, as Rose tried yet another approach to making decent gravy. "Necessity," she replied, stirring the pan with fierce concentration. "When you discover that no one's coming to save you, you learn to save yourself." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Bo understood that Rose wasn't just talking about cooking or surviving in a frontier cabin. She was talking about the deeper kind of survival, the kind that required rebuilding yourself from the ground up when everything you thought you knew about your life turned out to be wrong. During the long evenings by the fire, they began to share stories. Bo told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to hunt and track from his father, about the dreams he'd had before the war changed everything. Rose spoke carefully about her life in Philadelphia, about losing her parents to consumption, about the loneliness that had made Marcus Whitfield's attention seem like salvation instead of the trap it became. "I was so naive," she said one night, staring into the flames. "I thought love was supposed to feel like drowning, like losing yourself completely in another person. I didn't realize that was exactly the problem." "What do you think love should it feel like now?" Bo asked. Rose was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Safe," she said finally, "like coming home to yourself instead of losing yourself, like being seen clearly and valued for exactly who you are." Bo felt something shift in his chest at her words, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or loneliness. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not someone to complete him, but someone to understand him. Someone who could see past the rumors and the rough edges to the man he was trying to be. One afternoon, while Rose was mending a tear in his winter coat, she discovered something in the inner pocket that made her pause. She pulled out a small wooden carving, rough but recognizable as a rose in bloom, its petals carefully shaped by patient hands. "Did you make this?" she asked, holding it up to catch the light. Bo felt heat rise in his cheeks. "It's nothing. Just something to keep my hands busy during the long evenings." But Rose turned the carving over in her palm, examining the careful detail work, the way each petal had been shaped with obvious care. "It's beautiful, Bo. You have real talent. It's just whittling." No, it's art. Rose looked up at him, and he saw something new in her expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. You see beauty in things, and you create it with your own hands. That's a gift. Beau had never thought of his woodworking as anything more than a way to pass time, but the way Rose spoke about it made him see it differently. Maybe there was more to him than he'd given himself credit for. Maybe he wasn't just a broken-down soldier with a questionable past and no prospects. Maybe he was someone worth knowing. As the days passed and the snow began to settle, they ventured further from the cabin. Beau taught Rose how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to identify the signs that indicated a storm was coming, how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the wildlife. She was a quick learner, asking thoughtful questions and applying his lessons with the same determination she brought to everything else. One morning, as they were checking the snares Beau had set for rabbits, Rose stopped suddenly and pointed toward a stand of aspen trees. "There," she whispered. "Do you see him?" Beau followed her gaze and spotted the old tomcat that had been haunting the edges of his property for months. The animal was thin and battle-scarred, one ear torn from some long-ago fight, but he'd survived the harsh winter through a combination of cunning and sheer stubbornness. "He's been coming around since November," Beau said quietly. "Too wild to. Let me get close, but I leave scraps out for him when I can." Rose watched the cat with obvious compassion. "He looks like he's been through his own kind of war. Haven't we all?" That evening, Rose surprised Beau by setting out a plate of meat scraps near the cabin door. She didn't say anything about it, but Beau noticed and he understood. They were both learning that kindness could be expressed in small gestures, that caring for something vulnerable could be its own form of healing. The old Tom never did let them touch him, but he began showing up more regularly, drawn by the reliable food and perhaps by the sense that he'd found a place where his scars didn't make him unwelcome. Beau found himself looking forward to the cat's visits, to the way Rose's face would light up when she spotted him through the window. It was during one of these quiet moments, watching Rose scatter crumbs for the winter birds while the old Tom waited patiently for his evening meal, that Beau realized something fundamental had changed. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years had begun to fade, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: contentment. But even as he allowed himself to hope, a part of him remained cautious. Rose had left once before, and the world beyond their small valley was still full of threats and complications. The bubble of peace they'd created couldn't last forever, and Beau found himself treasuring each day while dreading the moment when reality would intrude once again. Outside, the pocket watch in his coat marked the passage of time with silent precision, even in its brokenness. Time was moving forward, as it always did, carrying them toward whatever came next. But for now, in this moment, they had each other and the simple satisfaction of work shared and warmth earned through their own efforts. It was enough. For the first time in his adult life, Beau Carter felt like what he had was enough. The smell of something burning roused Beau from his morning coffee 2 weeks after the storm. He looked up to find Rose standing over the stove, frantically waving a dish towel at a pan that was producing more smoke than seemed physically possible from whatever she'd been attempting to cook. "I thought I could make pancakes," she said, looking defeated as she surveyed the charred remains. "My mother used to make them every Sunday morning." Beau got up and gently took the pan from her hands, carrying it outside to cool in the snow. When he came back, Rose was sitting at the table with her head in her hands, and he realized this wasn't really about pancakes at all. "Tell me about her," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Rose looked up, surprised. "My mother, the woman who made pancakes every Sunday morning." For a moment, Rose's expression softened with memory. Her name was Catherine. She had the most beautiful voice, used to sing while she cooked. The kitchen always smelled like cinnamon and vanilla when she was making breakfast. Rose's voice caught slightly. "She died when I was 19. Consumption took her slowly, and by the end she couldn't even get out of bed." Papa died 6 months later. I think he just couldn't bear to live without her. Bo nodded, understanding that kind of loss. What happened to their recipes? I have some of them. In a little book she gave me before she died. Rose gestured toward her carpet bag. I've been afraid to use it. Afraid I'd ruin her memory by doing everything wrong. Or maybe you'd honor her memory by trying. Rose considered this, then got up and retrieved a small, leather-bound book from her belongings. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and when she opened it, Bo could see pages filled with careful handwriting in faded brown ink. Recipes, measurements, little notes about timing and technique written in a mother's hand for a daughter she knew would have to cook for herself someday. She wrote down everything, Rose said, running her finger along one of the pages. Even the simple things I thought I already knew. They spent the rest of the morning working through Catherine Ellington's recipe for pancakes, with Bo reading the instructions aloud while Rose measured and mixed. The first batch was still a disaster, too thick and gummy, but the second attempt showed promise, and by the third try, they had something that actually resembled food. She would have liked you, Rose said as they ate the slightly lopsided pancakes. With honey Bo had traded for in town last summer. Mama always said the measure of a man was in how he treated the things that couldn't help him in return. What made her think that? Rose smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. She used to watch Papa feed the stray dogs that hung around our neighborhood. Never asked for anything in return, never tried to make them into pets, just saw they were hungry and fed them. She paused, looking out the window where the old tomcat was making his morning rounds. Kind of like what you do. The comparison made Bo uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. He'd never thought of his small acts of kindness as anything worth noting, but the way Rose spoke about them made them seem larger somehow, more significant. Over the following days, Rose threw herself into learning the domestic skills that frontier life demanded. She practiced cooking with the determination of someone who understood that competence meant survival. She learned to manage the temperamental stove, to stretch ingredients when supplies ran low, to preserve food against future need. But it was the evenings that Bo treasured most. After the day's work was done, and they'd shared whatever Rose had managed to produce for dinner, they would sit by the fire and talk. Real conversation, the kind that revealed layers beneath the surface, politeness most people settled for. Rose told him about her dreams before Marcus Whitfield had entered her life. Dreams of teaching children, of having a small house with a garden, of building something lasting and good. Bo found himself sharing things he'd never spoken aloud, his love of books, his fascination with the way light changed throughout the day, his secret hope that someday he might build something more permanent than the rough cabin that sheltered them now. "What kind of house would you build?" Rose asked one evening, her hands busy with mending while they talked. Bo stared into the fire, picturing it. Something with big windows, so you could watch the seasons change. A proper kitchen for someone who likes to cook, maybe a room just for books with shelves built right into the walls. And a porch, Rose added. Somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the stars come out. Yeah, a porch. They were quiet for a moment, both lost in the shared vision of something that seemed impossibly far from their current reality. But the dream felt good, felt possible in a way that dreams hadn't for either of them in a very long time. "Do you really think the townspeople see you as dangerous?" Rose asked suddenly. The question caught Bo off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been thinking about it, about what you told me about the man who died in Colorado. And I think there's more to that story than you're telling me." Bo set down his coffee cup, suddenly tense. "Rose, I'm not asking you to confess to anything," she said quickly. "I'm asking if you're protecting someone, because the way you talk about it, the way you carry that guilt, it doesn't sound like the guilt of someone who did something wrong. It sounds like the guilt of someone who couldn't prevent something wrong from happening." The insight hit too close to home. Bo had never told anyone the full truth about Colorado, about the young woman who'd been attacked by her husband, about arriving just moments too late to save her, but in time to stop the man from finishing what he'd started. By the time the sheriff arrived, the husband was dead, and Beau was standing over the body with blood on his hands and murder in his eyes. Self-defense. The sheriff had ruled eventually, but not before the story had spread, growing in the telling until Beau became the villain instead of the man who'd tried to help. It was easier to let people think the worst of him than to relive that night. Easier to carry the burden alone than to explain why he'd been too late to save a life that mattered. "Some stories are better left buried," he said finally. Rose nodded, accepting his reticence without pushing further. "I understand. But Beau, whatever happened, whoever you couldn't save, carrying that guilt won't bring them back, and it won't make you a better man than you already are." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were kind. Rose saw him clearly, saw the man he was trying to be instead of the man his past had painted him to be. It was a gift he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he was grateful for all the same. The next morning brought news that shattered their peaceful isolation. A rider came through the valley, stopping at Beau's cabin to warn that the territorial marshal was asking questions in town, looking for information about a woman named Rose Ellington who disappeared from Philadelphia several months earlier. "Her fiancé's offering a reward," the rider explained, stamping snow from his boots on Beau's porch. "Says she's not in her right mind, needs medical attention. Marshal seems inclined to believe him." Beau felt Rose go very still beside him, her hand finding his arm in an unconscious gesture of support or supplication. The peaceful world they'd built together was about to come crashing down, and they both knew it. "Much obliged for the warning," Beau told the rider, pressing a silver coin into the man's hand. After the rider left, Rose and Beau stood in the doorway, looking out at the valley that had become their sanctuary. The snow was melting now, creating rivulets that would soon become rushing streams, carrying the winter's accumulation down to the plains below. Spring was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. "He found me," Rose said quietly. "Not yet, he hasn't. Beau, you don't understand. Marcus has connections, influence. If the territorial marshal is looking for me, then we'll deal with it when the time comes." Beau turned to face her, his expression resolute. "You're not going back to him, Rose, not while I'm breathing." The declaration hung between them, carrying implications neither of them had been ready to voice until now. Rose looked up at him, and in her eyes Beau saw gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made his chest tight with possibilities he'd given up hoping for. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Beau thought about the question, about all the reasons he could give that would sound noble or practical or logical, but in the end, there was only one truth that mattered. "Because you see, me," he said simply, "the real me, and because when I look at you, I see home." Outside, the old tomcat appeared at the edge of the clearing, waiting patiently for his evening meal. Soon, there would be decisions to make, battles to fight, a future to forge from the uncertain present. But for now, they had this moment, this recognition of something precious that had grown between them despite all the odds against it. Rose reached up and touched Beau's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite gentleness. Then, "We'll face whatever comes together." "Together," Beau agreed, and sealed the promise with their first kiss as the sun set over the Wyoming mountains and painted their small world in shades of gold and hope. Spring arrived in Wyoming with the subtlety of an avalanche. The snow that had seemed permanent just weeks earlier now retreated in daily defeats, revealing brown earth and the stubborn green shoots of new growth. Beau spent his mornings clearing drainage channels around the cabin to prevent flooding, while Rose worked in what would soon become a garden, turning soil that hadn't seen cultivation in the 3 years since Beau had built his solitary life in this valley. It was during one of these morning work sessions that Beau found himself carving again. His hands seemed to move of their own accord during quiet moments, shaping bits of wood into forms that pleased him. The wooden rose he'd made for Rose had been the beginning, but now he found himself creating other things. A small bird with outstretched wings, a horse's head with flowing mane, even a tiny replica of their cabin, complete with miniature windows and a chimney. Rose discovered his growing collection one afternoon while organizing the cabin's interior for the warmer weather. Ahead, she found the wooden figures wrapped in cloth and tucked away in a corner where Bo thought no one would look. "My word," she breathed, unwrapping each piece with careful hands. "Bo, these are extraordinary. They're just something to do with my hands," he protested, but he couldn't hide the pleasure in his eyes as she examined each carving with obvious admiration. "This isn't just keeping your hands busy. This is art, real art." Rose held up the tiny cabin, marveling at the detail work he'd managed to achieve with nothing but a pocket knife and patience. "You could sell these in town, maybe even in Cheyenne." The suggestion made Bo uncomfortable. He'd never thought of his whittling as anything commercial, anything that might connect him to the broader world beyond their valley. But the way Rose spoke about his work with genuine respect and excitement made him consider possibilities he'd never entertained. "Folks around here aren't much for buying art," he said. "Then maybe it's time to find folks who are." That evening, as they sat by the fire with the day's work behind them, Rose brought up the subject again. She'd been thinking about it, she said, and she had ideas about how Bo might turn his talent into something that could support them both. "There's a woman in Cheyenne, Mrs. Henderson, who has a shop that sells handmade goods to travelers on the railroad. I met her once when I was passing through. She's always looking for quality craftsmanship, especially pieces that capture the spirit of the West." Bo listened as Rose outlined her plan, her enthusiasm growing with each detail. She could write to Mrs. Henderson, send some samples of Bo's work, maybe arrange a meeting. If the woman was interested, it could mean regular income, enough to improve their life without requiring Bo to compromise his principles or his privacy. "You really think people would buy them?" Bo asked, turning one of his carvings over in his hands. "I think people would treasure them," Rose replied firmly. "You put something of yourself into each piece, something that machine-made goods can never have. That's worth paying for." As the days lengthened and warmed, their routine evolved to accommodate the changing season. Bo continued his outdoor work, while Rose divided her time between domestic tasks and what she called business correspondence. She wrote careful letters to contacts from her former life in Philadelphia, people who might be interested in Bo's work or who could connect them with others who would be. It was dangerous, this reaching out into the wider world. Each letter carried the risk of drawing Marcus Whitfield's attention back to them. But Rose was careful, using friends' addresses as intermediaries, never mentioning their exact location. She was building a network of possibilities while trying to stay invisible to the man who hunted her. One afternoon, while Bo was repairing the cabin's roof, where winter had found its weaknesses, Rose made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about his past. She was cleaning out the space beneath his bed, preparing to store winter clothing until next year, when her hand encountered something unexpected. A wooden box wedged far back against the wall. "Bo," she called, "there's something under here." He came down from the roof, and together they pulled out a box he'd forgotten was there. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were papers he hadn't looked at in years. Military documents, commendations, a letter of recommendation from his commanding officer that painted a picture of heroism and leadership that bore little resemblance to the stories that had followed him to Wyoming. Rose read through the papers. With growing amazement, "Bo, you were decorated multiple times. Your commander calls you one of the finest soldiers it has ever been my privilege to command." That was a long time ago. This letter is dated just 2 years ago. It's a recommendation for a position with the territorial government. You never followed up on it? Bo took the papers from her hands, studying documents that felt like artifacts from someone else's life. "I was a different man then, before Colorado, before everything went wrong." "What if everything didn't go wrong?" Rose asked quietly. What if everything just went differently than you planned? The distinction seemed important to her, and Bo found himself considering it. He'd spent so long thinking of his life as a series of failures and compromises that he'd never stopped to consider whether some of those apparent failures might have been leading him somewhere better. If he hadn't left the military, he never would have come to Wyoming. If he hadn't come to Wyoming, he never would have placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride. If Rose hadn't responded to that advertisement and then returned months later when she needed sanctuary, "You think there's a pattern to it all?" he asked. "I think sometimes the worst things that happen to us are just the universe's way of getting us where we need to be." That night, as they lay in their separate beds with the fire burning low between them, Bo found himself thinking about patterns and purposes, about the way his life had twisted and turned to bring him to this moment. Rose's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but he remained awake, studying the play of shadows on the cabin walls and considering possibilities. The next morning brought visitors, neighbors from down the valley who rarely ventured, to Bo's isolated homestead. The Morrison family had been struggling through a difficult time, and they'd come to ask for Bo's help with a problem that required his particular skills. "It's our eldest boy, Tom," Mrs. Morrison explained, while her husband stood awkwardly by the door. "He's been having nightmares since he came back from working the cattle drives down south. Won't talk about what happened, won't sleep more than an hour at a time. We thought maybe since you served—" Bo understood immediately. The boy had seen something during his time away, something that had carved itself into his mind the way war carved itself into soldiers. He was carrying ghosts that only someone who'd carried similar burdens could help him understand. "I'll talk to him," Bo promised. The conversation with young Tom Morrison took place over several days, long walks through the valley where the boy could speak without feeling trapped or judged. Bo recognized the signs, the way Tom's eyes darted constantly, searching for threats that existed only in memory, the way his hands shook when he talked about certain sounds or smells, the crushing weight of guilt over things he couldn't have prevented. "It doesn't make sense," Tom said during one of their walks. "I didn't even fight in a war. I just saw some men do terrible things to other men, and I couldn't stop it. Why does that make me feel like I'm the one who's broken?" Bo stopped walking and turned to face the young man. "Because when we see evil and can't prevent it, we carry the weight of it anyway. That's not broken, Tom. That's human, through patient conversation and the kind of understanding that could only come from shared experience. Bo helped Tom begin to process what he'd witnessed. He taught the boy techniques for managing the nightmares, ways to ground himself when the memories became overwhelming, strategies for carrying the burden without letting it crush him. Rose watched these interactions with growing admiration for the man she'd once dismissed as rough and simple. There was nothing simple about the care Bo showed to a traumatized young man, nothing rough about the gentle patience he brought to the healing process. She began to understand that Bo's quiet manner wasn't a limitation. It was a strength that allowed others to feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "You should be teaching," she told him one evening after Tom had made a particularly significant breakthrough. "Teaching what? How to survive the unsurvivable, how to carry pain without being destroyed by it, how to find purpose after everything you thought you knew about yourself has been shattered." Bo considered this, recognizing truth in her words, but unsure how such knowledge could be shared beyond individual conversations like the ones he'd had with Tom. But Rose was already thinking ahead, envisioning possibilities that combined Bo's gift for helping traumatized souls with his artistic talents and her own skills at organization and communication. "What if we built something here?" she said, her excitement growing as the idea took shape. "Not just a home for us, but a place where people like Tom could come to heal. A place where you could teach them to carve their pain into something beautiful, the way you've carved yours." The vision Rose painted was ambitious beyond anything Bo had ever imagined for himself. But as she spoke, he found himself caught up in her enthusiasm, beginning to see how all the scattered pieces of his life might fit together into something larger and more meaningful than mere survival. Outside their window, the old tomcat appeared. For his evening meal, moving with the confidence of an animal that had learned to trust in the reliability of kindness. Spring was transforming the valley, bringing new growth and new possibilities. And inside the cabin, two people who'd given up on their dreams were discovering that sometimes the best dreams are the ones you build together, one careful piece at a time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May, carried by the same postal rider who'd brought word of the marshal's inquiries weeks earlier. But this time, the man's expression was grim as he handed the envelope to Rose, and his eyes kept darting toward the tree line as if he expected trouble to emerge from the shadows. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you might want to be extra careful for a while. There's been talk in town about strangers asking questions, well-dressed men who don't seem like they belong in these parts." Rose's hand trembled as she accepted the letter, recognizing the bold handwriting on the envelope before she even looked at the return address. Marcus Whitfield had found her again, and this time he wasn't content to work through official channels. After the rider left, Rose and Beau retreated to the cabin where she opened the letter with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. The contents were exactly what she'd feared. A mixture of false concern and barely concealed threats wrapped in the language of a man who believed he owned her. "My dearest Rose," the letter began, "I have been sick with worry since your unfortunate departure from Philadelphia. The doctors assure me that your condition is treatable, but only if you return to proper care immediately. I have arranged for professional assistance to help escort you home, as I fear your judgment may be compromised by your current circumstances." Beau read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each line. The letter was cleverly written, designed to make Rose sound mentally unstable, while positioning Marcus as the concerned fiancé trying to save her from her own poor decisions. To anyone who didn't know the truth, it would seem like the reasonable plea of a man trying to rescue the woman. "He loved, he's coming," Rose said quietly. "The professional assistants he mentions, those will be men he's hired to bring me back whether I want to go or not. How long do we have?" Rose studied the postmark, calculating travel time and the likelihood that Marcus would want to handle this personally. "A week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. He'll want to coordinate with the territorial marshal, make sure everything looks legal and proper." The next few days passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and preparation. On the surface, their routine continued unchanged. Beau worked on expanding the garden, while Rose tended to her correspondence and domestic tasks. But underneath the ordinary activities, they were both preparing for a confrontation that would determine the course of their future. Beau spent his evenings cleaning and checking his weapons, not with the intention of starting a fight, but with the grim understanding that he might need to finish one. His military training had taught him the value of preparation, and the skills that had kept him alive during the war were as sharp as ever, despite years of peaceful living. Rose, meanwhile, was making preparations of her own. She wrote detailed letters to the contacts she'd been cultivating, explaining the situation and asking for their help in establishing her legal independence from Marcus. She also began organizing important documents and personal items, creating a plan for quick departure if circumstances required it. But it was during one of their evening conversations that Rose revealed the most crucial piece of information, something she'd kept hidden even from Beau until the immediate threat forced her to share it. "There's something you need to know about Marcus," she said, staring into the fire as if the flames might give her courage. "He's not just a wealthy man with social connections. He's involved in things that aren't entirely legal." Beau set down his carving and gave her his full attention. "What kind of things?" "Import business, officially. But I started noticing discrepancies in his records. Shipments that didn't match the manifests, meetings with men who didn't seem like legitimate traders. Rose took a shaky breath. I think he's been smuggling goods through Philadelphia, using his legitimate business as a cover for contraband. The revelation changed everything. If Marcus was involved in criminal activity, it meant his pursuit of Rose might be about more than injured pride or obsession. It could be about silencing a witness who knew too much about his illegal operations. "Do you have proof?" Bo asked. Rose nodded toward her carpetbag. "Some. Not enough to convict him, but enough to cause him serious problems if it reached the right people. Then we need to get it to the right people. Bo, you don't understand how powerful Marcus is, how many officials he has in his pocket. Even if we could prove his crimes, there's no guarantee justice would be served." Bo stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the valley that had become their sanctuary. The spring evening was peaceful, with long shadows stretching across the meadow and the sound of rushing water from the snow-melt streams. It was a good place to make a stand, if standing became necessary. "Maybe justice doesn't always come through official channels," he said quietly. Rose joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Marcus Whitfield has probably never faced an enemy who wasn't bound by the same social rules he uses to protect himself. But those rules don't apply out here." The implication hung between them, that Bo was prepared to use his military skills to protect Rose, even if it meant operating outside the law. It was a line he'd never thought he'd consider crossing, but the alternative was watching Rose be dragged back to a life that would destroy her. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me," Rose said firmly. "And I won't let him take you," Bo replied with equal conviction. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who'd found something precious and were prepared to fight for it. Outside, the old tomcat made his evening rounds, moving through the shadows with the confidence of a creature that had learned to survive by being smart, careful, and absolutely ruthless when cornered. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, young Tom Morrison, but not the broken boy who'd first sought Bo's help. This was a young man who'd found his footing again, whose eyes were clear and whose hands were steady. He'd come to thank Bo for the guidance that had helped him heal, but he stayed when he sensed that his mentor was facing troubles of his own. "Mr. Carter," Tom said, after hearing a carefully edited version of the situation, "my pa always said that a man who helps others in their time of need deserves the same consideration when his time comes. Whatever you're facing, you don't have to face it alone." The offer of support was echoed by other neighbors over the following days, as word spread quietly through the valley that Bo and Rose might be in danger. These were people who valued loyalty and understood that sometimes decent folks had to stand together against those who would exploit or harm the innocent. Bo found himself overwhelmed by the community response. He'd lived as an outsider for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. But Rose's presence in his life had changed how others saw him, and perhaps how he saw himself. He was no longer just the mysterious stranger with a questionable past. He was a neighbor, a friend, someone worth defending. As the week progressed and the threat of Marcus's arrival grew more imminent, Bo and Rose made their final preparations. They established signals with their neighbors, created plans for various scenarios, and made peace with the possibility that their peaceful life in the valley might be ending regardless of how the confrontation played out. But it was on a quiet evening. As they sat together watching the stars emerge over the mountains, that Rose made a confession that changed everything Bo thought he understood about their relationship. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about why I really came back here." Bo waited, sensing that this was important in ways that went beyond their current crisis. "When I left here the first time, it wasn't just because I was afraid of the rough life. It was because I was afraid of you. Not of you hurting me, but of you seeing who I really was underneath all the Philadelphia polish. I was afraid you'd realize you'd gotten a poor bargain." "Rose, let me finish," she said gently. When I went back to Marcus, I tried to convince myself that I belonged in that world, that I could be the kind of woman he wanted. But every day, I felt myself disappearing a little more, becoming smaller and quieter until I was barely there at all. And then one night, when he was explaining why my opinions didn't matter, I suddenly remembered something. What? The way you looked at me that first morning, when you made coffee and didn't expect me to be grateful for it. Like I was a person who deserved simple kindness just for existing. Marcus has never looked at me that way, not once in all the months I knew him. Rose turned to face Bo fully, her eyes reflecting the starlight. I didn't come back here because I had nowhere else to go. I came back because this is where I learned what it felt like to be seen as enough, exactly as I am. I came back because I'd rather be poor and real than rich and disappearing. The words hit Bo like a physical force, rewriting everything he'd believed about Rose's return. She hadn't come back to him as a last resort. She'd come back because she'd chosen him, chosen the life they could build together over the gilded cage Marcus offered. I love you, he said, the words emerging without conscious decision. Not the woman you think you should be, but the woman you are. Strong enough to leave everything familiar, brave enough to start over, stubborn enough to burn pancakes 6 times until you get them right. Rose laughed through tears she didn't remember starting to shed. I love you too. Your gentleness with broken things, your patience with my disasters in the kitchen, the way you see beauty in a piece of wood and carve it into something wonderful. They held each other under the vast Wyoming sky, 2 people who'd found their way home to each other despite all the obstacles the world had placed in their path. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges Marcus Whitfield represented, but tonight they had this, the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. In the distance, a nightbird called from the aspens, its song carrying across the valley like a promise that some things endure despite all efforts to destroy them. And in the cabin that had sheltered their growing love, the wooden rose Bo had carved sat on the windowsill, catching the moonlight and holding it like a symbol of everything worth fighting for. They came at dawn on a Thursday, emerging from the morning mist like phantoms made flesh. Bo spotted them first through the cabin window, 4 mounted figures approaching in formation, too disciplined to be casual travelers, too well-armed to be merchants. He recognized the tactics immediately, a frontal approach designed to draw attention while others moved to flanking positions. Rose, he said quietly, not taking his eyes from the window. They're here. She joined him at the window, her face going pale as she recognized the lead rider. Marcus Whitfield sat his horse like a man accustomed to command, his expensive clothes somehow managing to look pristine despite days of travel through rough country. Beside him rode 2 men who had the look of hired professionals, the kind who asked no questions and left no witnesses. But it was the 4th man who made Bo's blood run cold. The territorial marshal's badge caught the morning light, and Bo could see from the man's bearing that this wasn't some corrupt official in Marcus's pocket. This was a lawman who believed he was conducting legitimate business, rescuing a disturbed woman from her own poor judgment. Marshal Hawkins, Rose whispered, recognizing the man from wanted posters she'd seen in town. He's honest, Bo. He won't listen to anything we say against Marcus. The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. Marcus dismounted with theatrical flair, his movements calculated to project confidence and authority. He was a handsome man in his 40s, the kind who aged well because he'd never known real hardship, and his smile as he approached the cabin was the practiced expression of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm and manipulation. "Rose, my dear," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the perfect tone of concerned affection. "Thank God I've found you. When you disappeared so suddenly, I feared the worst." Bo stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between Marcus and the cabin door. The movement was subtle but deliberate, and Marcus's eyes sharpened as he took in Bo's military bearing and the way his hand rested casually near his sidearm. "Mr. Carter," I presume, Marcus continued, his tone growing cooler. I'm Marcus Whitfield, Rose's fiancé. I've come to take her home for the medical attention she desperately needs. I'm not sick, Rose said, appearing beside Bo despite his attempt to shield her. And I'm not going anywhere with you. Marshal Hawkins urged his horse forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. Ma'am, I understand you might be confused, but Mr. Whitfield has provided medical documentation of your condition. The doctors in Philadelphia are concerned about your mental state, especially after your episode at the wedding. The word episode was loaded with implication, suggesting instability and irrationality. Bo could see how carefully Marcus had constructed this narrative, how every detail was designed to make Rose appear unreliable while positioning himself as the patient, suffering victim of her mental breakdown. What episode? Bo asked, his voice carrying the hard edge that had once struck fear into Confederate scouts who found themselves on the wrong end of his attention. Marcus's smile faltered slightly at Bo's tone, but he recovered quickly. Rose became hysterical during our wedding ceremony. She began making wild accusations, claiming I was trying to control her, that she was in danger. The poor dear was so overwrought that she actually struck the minister before fleeing the church. The story was believable enough to explain Rose's presence in Wyoming while painting her as emotionally unstable. Bo had to admire the calculation behind it, even as he felt sick at the implications. That's not what happened, Rose said, but her voice lacked the conviction needed to counter Marcus's confident narrative. Of course you don't remember it clearly, darling, Marcus said with perfect condescension. That's part of your condition. The doctors explained that traumatic episodes often create false memories, paranoid delusions about the very people trying to help you. Marshal Hawkins was nodding along, clearly convinced by Marcus's reasonable manner and professional presentation. Bo realized that anything they said in Rose's defense would only reinforce the image of a delusional woman and the man enabling her fantasies. But then Marcus made his mistake, a small one, but enough to catch Bo's trained attention. As he gestured toward Rose, his coat fell open to reveal a shoulder holster containing a weapon that Bo recognized immediately. A Navy Colt with custom grips, the kind carried by federal marshals and certain types of government agents. The pieces clicked together in Bo's mind with crystalline clarity. Marcus Whitfield wasn't just a wealthy businessman with criminal connections. He was something far more dangerous, a federal agent using his position to facilitate illegal operations while maintaining the perfect cover of respectability. Marshal Hawkins, Bo said carefully, might I have a word with you privately? The marshal looked surprised but nodded. As they stepped away from the others, Bo reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a leather folder he hadn't touched in years. Inside were credentials he'd hoped never to use again, documents that identified him not as Bo Carter, simple homesteader, but as Major Robert Carter, United States Army Intelligence, on indefinite assignment. Sir, Bo said quietly, opening the folder so only Hawkins could see. I need you to understand that there's more to this situation than Mr. Whitfield has explained. Hawkins studied the credentials, his expression shifting from confusion to sharp attention. Your military intelligence? On extended assignment investigating irregularities in territorial import records. Mr. Whitfield is a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation. The lie came easily, built from fragments of truth that made it believable. Bo had indeed been investigating import irregularities during his last assignment, and Marcus's smuggling activities would certainly fall under that category. The fact that Bo's current presence in Wyoming had nothing to do with any official investigation was a detail the marshal didn't need to know. What kind of irregularities? Hawkins asked. The kind that involve using legitimate businesses to move contraband through territorial ports, often with the cooperation of corrupt officials. Bo glanced meaningfully toward Marcus, who was becoming visibly agitated by their private conversation. Miss Ellington became aware of these activities during her engagement to Mr. Whitfield. Her mental breakdown was actually an attempt to escape before she could be silenced permanently. Hawkins followed Bo's gaze to Marcus, who was now pacing nervously while his hired men fingered their weapons. "You have proof of these allegations?" "Miss Ellington has documentation that she removed from Mr. Whitfield's office before fleeing Philadelphia. Manifests, shipping records, correspondence with known smugglers. I've been protecting her while she prepared to testify before a federal grand jury." The fabrication was becoming more elaborate, but Bo could see it taking hold in the marshal's mind. Hawkins was an honest lawman, and the possibility that he'd been manipulated into helping a criminal retrieve a potential witness would horrify him. "Why wasn't I informed of this investigation?" Hawkins demanded. "Because we weren't sure how deep the corruption went," Bo replied, letting suspicion creep into his voice. "Federal marshals have been compromised before, and Mr. Whitfield's resources are considerable." The implication hung in the air that Hawkins himself might have been suspected of corruption. It was a calculated insult that would either make the marshal an enemy or a fierce ally, depending on his character. Bo was betting on the latter, based on Rose's assessment of the man's reputation for integrity. Hawkins's face darkened with anger, but it was directed toward Marcus rather than Bo. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "Begging your pardon, Major, but if I've been used to help a criminal silence a witness—" "You couldn't have known," Bo assured him. "Mr. Whitfield's cover is extremely sophisticated. But now that you understand the situation, I need to ask for your assistance in protecting Miss Ellington until she can be safely transported to testify." The marshal nodded grimly. "What do you need?" "First, I need you to inform Mr. Whitfield that you're taking Miss Ellington into protective custody pending further investigation. Second, I need you to place him under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness." Hawkins looked toward Marcus, who was now arguing heatedly with his hired men about something they couldn't overhear. "What about his men? If they're smart, they'll ride away quietly when they see their employer in custody. If they're not smart," Bo's hand drifted toward his weapon, "well, you'll have witnesses to whatever happens next." As they walked back toward the cabin, Bo felt the familiar weight of deception settling over him like an old coat. He was once again living a lie, pretending to be someone he wasn't for the greater good. But this time, he was protecting something that mattered more than any mission he'd ever undertaken. Marcus sensed the change in dynamic immediately. His confident smile faded as he took in Hawkins's grim expression and Bo's military bearing. "Is there a problem, Marshal?" "Mr. Whitfield," Hawkins said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "You can't be serious. This woman is mentally unstable, and this man is Major Robert Carter, United States Army Intelligence," Hawkins interrupted. "And Miss Ellington is under federal protection as a witness in an ongoing investigation into your illegal activities." Marcus's face went white, then red, as the implications sank in. All his careful planning, all his manipulations, had been undone by the one possibility he'd never considered, that the rough homesteader he'd dismissed as irrelevant was actually a federal agent with the authority to destroy him. "This is impossible," Marcus snarled, his composure finally breaking completely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Marshal. I have connections that reach to Washington itself. When this is over, your career will be finished." "Maybe," Hawkins replied calmly, producing a pair of handcuffs. "But right now, you're under arrest." The hired men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Bo stepped forward with the fluid grace of a man who'd faced death 100 times and found it less frightening than the prospect of losing the key. "Woman he loved, gentlemen," he said quietly. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and about to become accessories to a federal crime. I'd suggest you consider your options very carefully. The men looked at each other, then at Marcus, then at the steady resolve in Beau's eyes. Whatever they were being paid, it wasn't enough to face down a federal marshal and a military intelligence officer who looked like he'd welcomed the chance to demonstrate his combat skills. "We're done here," the lead gunman said, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't what we signed up for." As the hired men rode away, leaving Marcus alone and defeated, Rose stepped out of the cabin with a small leather portfolio in her hands. "Marshal Hawkins," she said, "these are copies of the documents I mentioned. Shipping manifests, correspondence, financial records. Everything you need to prove Marcus's illegal activities." The marshal accepted the portfolio, but Beau caught the slight tremor in Rose's hands as she passed it over. The documents were real enough, but they were incomplete. Fragments of evidence rather than the comprehensive proof his fabricated story had claimed. It would have to be enough. As Hawkins secured Marcus in custody and prepared to transport him back to Cheyenne for formal charges, Rose and Beau stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the man who'd terrorized her dreams being led. "Away in shackles. Is it over?" Rose asked quietly. Beau looked down at her, this woman who'd trusted him enough to follow his desperate gambit, who'd played her part perfectly despite the enormous risk they'd both taken. "It's over," he promised. But even as he spoke the words, Beau knew that nothing was ever truly over. Marcus Whitfield had connections, resources, lawyers who would work tirelessly to overturn his arrest. The federal investigation Beau had invented would need to become real if their deception was going to hold. And somewhere in Washington, people would soon be asking uncomfortable questions about Major Robert Carter and his unauthorized activities in Wyoming Territory. The truth was that their fight for freedom had only just begun. But for now, in this moment, they had won a crucial victory. Marcus was in custody, Rose was safe, and they had bought themselves time to build a defense against whatever retribution might follow. As the dust settled from the departing horses, the old tomcat emerged from wherever he'd hidden during the confrontation. He approached the porch cautiously, as if testing whether the danger had truly passed, then settled into his usual spot in the morning sun. Rose laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Even he knows it's safe now." Beau pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how quickly their world had shifted from terror to hope. They had challenges ahead, deceptions to maintain, and a future to build from the uncertain present. But they would face it all together, united by love and tested by fire. The wooden rose still sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light and holding it like a promise of everything they'd fought to protect. They came at dawn on a Thursday, emerging from the morning mist like phantoms made flesh. Beau spotted them first through the cabin window, 4 mounted figures approaching in formation, too disciplined to be casual travelers, too well armed to be merchants. He recognized the tactics immediately, a frontal approach designed to draw attention while others moved to flanking positions. "Rose," he said quietly, not taking his eyes from the window. "They're here." She joined him at the window, her face going pale as she recognized the lead rider. Marcus Whitfield sat his horse like a man accustomed to command, his expensive clothes somehow managing to look pristine despite days of travel through rough country. Beside him rode 2 men who had the look of hired professionals, the kind who asked no questions and left no witnesses. But it was the 4th man who made Beau's blood run cold. The territorial marshal's badge caught the morning light, and Beau could see from the man's bearing that this wasn't some corrupt official in Marcus's pocket. This was a lawman who believed he was conducting legitimate business, rescuing a disturbed woman from her own poor judgment. "Marshal Hawkins," Rose whispered, recognizing the man from wanted posters she'd seen in town. "He's honest, Beau. He won't listen to anything we say against Marcus." The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough. To avoid any sudden moves, Marcus dismounted with theatrical flair, his movements calculated to project confidence and authority. He was a handsome man in his 40s, the kind who aged well because he'd never known real hardship, and his smile as he approached the cabin was the practiced expression of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm and manipulation. "Rose, my dear," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the perfect tone of concerned affection. "Thank God I've found you. When you disappeared so suddenly, I feared the worst." Bo stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between Marcus and the cabin door. The movement was subtle but deliberate, and Marcus's eyes sharpened as he took in Bo's military bearing and the way his hand rested casually near his sidearm. "Mr. Carter, I presume," Marcus continued, his tone growing cooler. "I'm Marcus Whitfield, Rose's fiancé. I've come to take her home for the medical attention she desperately needs." "I'm not sick," Rose said, appearing beside Bo despite his attempt to shield her. "And I'm not going anywhere with you." Marshal Hawkins urged his horse forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, I understand you might be confused, but Mr. Whitfield has provided medical documentation of your condition. The doctors in Philadelphia are concerned about your mental state, especially after your episode at the wedding." The word episode was loaded with implication, suggesting instability and irrationality. Bo could see how carefully Marcus had constructed this narrative, how every detail was designed to make Rose appear unreliable while positioning himself as the patient, suffering victim of her mental breakdown. "What episode?" Bo asked, his voice carrying the hard edge that had once struck fear into Confederate scouts who found themselves on the wrong end of his attention. Marcus's smile faltered slightly at Bo's tone, but he recovered quickly. "Rose became hysterical during our wedding ceremony. She began making wild accusations, claiming I was trying to control her, that she was in danger. The poor dear was so overwrought that she actually struck the minister before fleeing the church." The story was believable enough to explain Rose's presence in Wyoming while painting her as emotionally unstable. Bo had to admire the calculation behind it, even as he felt sick at the implications. "That's not what happened," Rose said, but her voice lacked the conviction needed to counter Marcus's confident narrative. "Of course you don't remember it clearly, darling," Marcus said with perfect condescension. "That's part of your condition. The doctors explained that traumatic episodes often create false memories, paranoid delusions about the very people trying to help you." Marshal Hawkins was nodding along, clearly convinced by Marcus's reasonable manner and professional presentation. Bo realized that anything they said in Rose's defense would only reinforce the image of a delusional woman and the man enabling her fantasies. But then Marcus made his mistake, a small one, but enough to catch Bo's trained attention. As he gestured toward Rose, his coat fell open to reveal a shoulder holster containing a weapon that Bo recognized immediately. A Navy Colt with custom grips, the kind carried by federal marshals and certain types of government agents. The pieces clicked together in Bo's mind with crystalline clarity. Marcus Whitfield wasn't just a wealthy businessman with criminal connections. He was something far more dangerous, a federal agent using his position to facilitate illegal operations while maintaining the perfect cover of respectability. "Marshal Hawkins," Bo said carefully, "might I have a word with you privately?" The marshal looked surprised but nodded. As they stepped away from the others, Bo reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a leather folder he hadn't touched in years. Inside were credentials he'd hoped never to use again. Documents that identified him not as Bo Carter, simple homesteader, but as Major Robert Carter, United States Army Intelligence, on indefinite assignment. "Sir," Bo said quietly, opening the folder so only Hawkins could see, "I need you to understand that there's more to this situation than Mr. Whitfield has explained." Hawkins studied the credentials, his expression shifting from confusion to sharp attention. "Your military intelligence? On extended assignment investigating irregularities in territorial import records." Mr. Whitfield is a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation. The lie came easily, built from fragments of truth that made it believable. Bo had indeed been investigating import irregularities during his last assignment, and Marcus's smuggling activities would certainly fall under that category. The fact that Bo's current presence in Wyoming had nothing to do with any official investigation was a detail the marshal didn't need to know. "What kind of irregularities?" Hawkins asked. "The kind that involve using legitimate businesses to move contraband through territorial ports, often with the cooperation of corrupt officials." Bo glanced meaningfully toward Marcus, who was becoming visibly agitated by their private conversation. Miss Ellington became aware of these activities during her engagement to Mr. Whitfield. Her mental breakdown was actually an attempt to escape before she could be silenced permanently. Hawkins followed Bo's gaze to Marcus, who was now pacing nervously while his hired men fingered their weapons. "You have proof of these allegations?" "Miss Ellington has documentation that she removed from Mr. Whitfield's office before fleeing Philadelphia. Manifests, shipping records, correspondence with known smugglers. I've been protecting her while she prepared to testify before a federal grand jury." The fabrication was becoming more elaborate, but Bo could see it taking hold in the marshal's mind. Hawkins was an honest lawman, and the possibility that he'd been manipulated into helping a criminal retrieve a potential witness would horrify him. "Why wasn't I informed of this investigation?" Hawkins demanded. "Because we weren't sure how deep the corruption went," Bo replied, letting suspicion creep into his voice. "Federal marshals have been compromised before, and Mr. Whitfield's resources are considerable." The implication hung in the air that Hawkins himself might have been suspected of corruption. It was a calculated insult that would either make the marshal an enemy or a fierce ally, depending on his character. Bo was betting on the latter, based on Rose's assessment of the man's reputation for integrity. Hawkins's face darkened with anger, but it was directed toward Marcus rather than Bo. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "Begging your pardon, Major, but if I've been used to help a criminal silence a witness—" "You couldn't have known," Bo assured him. "Mr. Whitfield's cover is extremely sophisticated. But now that you understand the situation, I need to ask for your assistance in protecting Miss Ellington until she can be safely transported to testify." The marshal nodded grimly. "What do you need?" "First, I need you to inform Mr. Whitfield that you're taking Miss Ellington into protective custody, pending further investigation. Second, I need you to place him under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness." Hawkins looked toward Marcus, who was now arguing heatedly with his hired men about something they couldn't overhear. "What about his men?" "If they're smart, they'll ride away quietly when they see their employer in custody. If they're not smart," Bo's hand drifted toward his weapon, "well, you'll have witnesses to whatever happens next." As they walked back toward the cabin, Bo felt the familiar weight of deception settling over him like an old coat. He was once, again, living a lie, pretending to be someone he wasn't for the greater good. But this time, he was protecting something that mattered more than any mission he'd ever undertaken. Marcus sensed the change in dynamic immediately. His confident smile faded as he took in Hawkins's grim expression and Bo's military bearing. "Is there a problem, Marshal?" "Mr. Whitfield," Hawkins said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "You can't be serious. This woman is mentally unstable, and this man is obviously— This man is Major Robert Carter, United States Army Intelligence," Hawkins interrupted. "And Miss Ellington is under federal protection as a witness in an ongoing investigation into your illegal activities." Marcus's face went white, then red, as the implications sank in. All his careful planning, all his manipulations, had been undone by the one possibility he'd never considered, that the rough homesteader he'd dismissed as irrelevant was actually a federal agent with the authority to destroy him. "This is impossible," Marcus snarled, his composure finally breaking completely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Marshal. I have connections that reach to Washington itself. When this is over, your career will be finished." "Maybe," Hawkins replied calmly, producing a pair of handcuffs. "But right now, you're under arrest." The hired men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Bo stepped forward with the fluid grace of a man who'd faced death 100 times and found it less frightening than the prospect of losing the woman he loved. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you're outnumbered, outgunned, and about to become accessories to a federal crime. I'd suggest you consider your options very carefully." The men looked at each other, then at Marcus, then at the steady resolve in Bo's eyes. Whatever they were being paid, it wasn't enough to face down a federal marshal and a military intelligence officer who looked like he'd welcome the chance to demonstrate his combat skills. "We're done here," the lead gunman said, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't what we signed up for." As the hired men rode away, leaving Marcus alone and defeated, Rose stepped out of the cabin with a small leather portfolio in her hands. "Marshal Hawkins," she said, "these are copies of the documents I mentioned, shipping manifests, correspondence, financial records, everything you need to prove Marcus's illegal activities." The marshal accepted the portfolio, but Bo caught the dough. Slight tremor in Rose's hands as she passed it over. The documents were real enough, but they were incomplete. Fragments of evidence rather than the comprehensive proof his fabricated story had claimed. It would have to be enough. As Hawkins secured Marcus in custody and prepared to transport him back to Cheyenne for formal charges, Rose and Bo stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the man who'd terrorized her dreams being led. "Away in shackles. Is it over?" Rose asked quietly. Bo looked down at her, this woman who'd trusted him enough to follow his desperate gambit, who'd played her part perfectly despite the enormous risk they'd both taken. "It's over," he promised. But even as he spoke the words, Bo knew that nothing was ever truly over. Marcus Whitfield had connections, resources, lawyers who would work tirelessly to overturn his arrest. The federal investigation Bo had invented would need to become real if their deception was going to hold. And somewhere in Washington, people would soon be asking uncomfortable questions about Major Robert Carter and his unauthorized activities in Wyoming territory. The truth was that their fight for freedom had only just begun. But for now, in this moment, they had won a crucial victory. Marcus was in custody, Rose was safe, and they had bought themselves time to build a defense against whatever retribution might follow. As the dust settled from the departing horses, the old tomcat emerged from wherever he'd hidden during the confrontation. He approached the porch cautiously, as if testing whether the danger had truly passed, then settled into his usual spot in the morning sun. Rose laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Even he knows it's safe now." Bo pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how quickly their world had shifted from terror to hope. They had challenges ahead, deceptions to maintain, and a future to build from the uncertain present. But they would face it all together, united by love and tested by fire. The wooden Rose still sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light and holding it like a promise of everything they'd fought to protect. The first shot came without warning, a rifle crack that shattered the morning stillness and sent splinters flying from the cabin's doorframe inches from Rose's head. Bo moved with the fluid precision of a man whose reflexes had been honed by years of combat, pulling Rose to safety, while simultaneously drawing his sidearm and identifying the shooter's position. "Northeast ridge," he called to his defenders, even as he was calculating angles and distances, with the automatic skill that had kept him alive through dozens of similar encounters. 200 yards behind the fallen pine, Marcus's men had spread out in a textbook flanking maneuver. using the natural terrain to establish overlapping fields of fire, while their leader retreated to a safe distance. These weren't hired thugs or corrupt lawmen. They were professional soldiers, probably veterans of the same conflict that had forged Bo's own skills. Tom Morrison returned fire from his position behind the woodpile, his shot going wide but forcing the attackers to take cover. The young man's hands were steady despite the danger, and Bo felt a flash of pride at how far Tom had come from the broken boy who'd first sought his help. "Stay low and pick your shots," Bo instructed his makeshift squad. "We don't have ammunition to waste, and every bullet needs to count." A second rifle cracked from the opposite direction, confirming Bo's tactical assessment. Marcus's men were trying to catch the defenders in a crossfire, forcing them to divide their attention between multiple threats. It was a sound strategy that would have been devastatingly effective against untrained opponents. But Bo Carter was far from untrained, and the men fighting beside him had the advantage of knowing every stone and shadow in this valley. What Marcus's mercenaries saw as open ground, the local men recognized as a maze of defensive positions and concealed movement routes. "Morrison, take young Tom and circle around to the creek bed," Bo ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "You can get behind that northeast shooter if you move fast and stay low." The elder Morrison nodded, understanding immediately. He'd fought Apache raiders in his younger days and knew the value of using terrain to even impossible odds. Within moments, he and his son had disappeared into the landscape like ghosts, leaving only disturbed grass to mark their passage. Bo positioned himself at the cabin's corner where he could cover the most likely approaches, while keeping Rose safely behind him. His rifle felt familiar in his hands, despite years of disuse, the weight and balance as comfortable as an old friend's handshake. "How many?" Rose asked, her voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead. 8, maybe 9. Professional quality. Bo took careful aim at a muzzle flash and squeezed the trigger, rewarded by a cry of pain from the rocks below. But they're operating in unfamiliar territory against people who know every inch of this ground. Another shot from the ridge, closer. This time, forcing Bo to duck as the bullet sparked off the stone foundation near his head. The shooter was good, very good, and Bo realized he was facing someone with skills comparable to his own. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouted commands, Bo heard the distinctive sound of Marcus Whitfield's voice calling out orders from his position of safety. The man was directing his mercenaries like pieces on a chessboard, treating the battle as an intellectual exercise rather than a life-or-death struggle. "Flank left and force them into the open," Marcus commanded. "I want this finished quickly and cleanly." But his mercenaries were learning that Wyoming ranchers weren't as easily intimidated as Philadelphia socialites. A shot from the creek bed dropped one of the flanking soldiers, and suddenly Marcus's tactical superiority didn't seem quite so overwhelming. Bo used the momentary confusion to advance his own position, moving to a stand of aspen trees that offered better cover and cleaner shooting angles. As he moved, he caught sight of Rose through the cabin window, her small derringer in her hands as she watched for threats that might approach from unexpected directions. The sight of her, brave, determined, ready to fight for their shared future, filled Bo with a fierce protective instinct that went beyond mere combat training. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that love could triumph over the kind of power Marcus represented. A bullet whined past Bo's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. The shooter was hidden in a cluster of boulders 50 yards away, using the rocks for cover while seeking a clear shot at the cabin. Bo marked the position and began the patient work of hunting a fellow hunter. Minutes stretched like hours as the two sides exchanged fire, each seeking the advantage that would break the stalemate. Bo's military training told him that time favored the defenders. Marcus's men were operating far from their supply base and would eventually be forced to either press a costly assault or withdraw. But his heart urged him toward more immediate action, knowing that every moment Rose remained in danger was a moment too long. The decision was made for him when he heard glass shatter from the direction of the cabin. One of Marcus's men had worked his way close enough to put a bullet through the kitchen window, dangerously near where Rose had taken shelter. Beau's response was immediate and devastating. Years of battlefield experience guided his movements as he flanked the shooter's position, using the terrain and his superior knowledge of the ground to approach unseen. The confrontation was brief and decisive, a single shot that ended the threat permanently, but the action had exposed Beau's position to the remaining attackers, and suddenly he found himself pinned down behind a fallen log as rifle fire erupted from multiple directions. Splinters and bark flew around him as Marcus's men concentrated their fire, trying to eliminate the defender who'd proven most dangerous to their assault. It was then that Rose made her choice. Instead of remaining safely hidden in the cabin, she appeared at the window with her small derringer raised, drawing the attention of the shooters long enough for Beau to reach better cover. Her 2 shots were precisely placed, not intended to kill, but to disrupt and distract at the crucial moment. The gambit worked perfectly. One attacker yelped in surprise as Rose's bullet clipped his shoulder, while another dove for cover as her second shot sparked off the rocks near his head. In the confusion that followed, Beau was able to reposition himself for the decisive phase of the battle. From his new vantage point, Beau could see the tactical situation clearly. 3 of Marcus's men were down, dead or wounded seriously enough to be out of the fight. The Morrisons had successfully flanked the northeast position and were keeping another shooter pinned down. That left Marcus himself and perhaps 3 effective combatants against Beau's remaining defenders. The odds were still challenging, but they were no longer impossible. More importantly, Beau could see the uncertainty creeping into the attackers' movements. They'd expected to overwhelm a single homesteader and his woman, not face organized resistance from trained fighters who knew the ground and weren't intimidated by superior numbers. "Marcus," Beau called out during a lull in the firing, "this isn't going the way you planned, is it?" The response was a furious volley of shots that accomplished nothing except wasting ammunition and revealing positions. Marcus's careful control was beginning to crack under the pressure of unexpected resistance. "You can't hold out forever, Carter," Marcus shouted back. "I have resources you can't imagine. More men, better equipment, connections that reach all. The way to Washington." "Maybe," Beau replied, adjusting his aim toward the sound of Marcus's voice. "But right now, all you have is what's left of your hired guns and the growing realization that you've bitten off more than you can chew." Another exchange of gunfire punctuated their verbal sparring, but Beau could sense the momentum shifting. Marcus's men were becoming more cautious, less aggressive, showing the reluctance of professionals who'd realized their contract might not be worth their lives. The old tomcat appeared briefly at the edge of the clearing, took one look at the chaos surrounding his feeding ground, and disappeared back into the safety of the trees. Even he understood that this particular storm needed to pass before normal life could resume. As the morning sun climbed higher and the shadow shortened, Beau prepared for the final phase of what was beginning to feel like a battle he might actually win. But victory would require one more calculated risk, one final gambit that would either end the threat permanently or cost him everything he'd fought to protect. The turning point came when young Tom Morrison proved that his healing had transformed him into something more than just a survivor. Moving with the patience his mentor had taught him, Tom worked his way through the creek bed until he was directly behind Marcus's command position. What happened next was as swift as it was decisive. "Drop your weapons," Tom's voice rang out clear and steady, his rifle trained on Marcus from 20 feet away. "All of you, now!" The remaining mercenaries found themselves caught in a crossfire. They couldn't escape, their leader suddenly vulnerable to a young man they'd dismissed as irrelevant. For a moment, the entire battlefield held its breath as Marcus weighed his options and found them all wanting. "You're making a mistake, boy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold authority he'd used to intimidate others for so many years. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I can do to you and your family?" Tom's response was to chamber another round with deliberate precision, the metallic click echoing across the suddenly quiet valley. "I know exactly who you are. You're the man who hurt the woman who taught me that healing is possible. You're the man who threatened the people who gave me back my life, and right now, you're the man looking down the barrel of my rifle." The transformation in Tom was remarkable to witness. This was no longer the broken boy who'd sought Bo's help months earlier. This was a man who'd found his strength through adversity and chosen to use it in defense of others. Bo felt a surge of pride that went beyond mere tactical satisfaction. Marcus's remaining men were professionals enough to recognize when a situation had turned hopeless. One by one, they laid down their weapons and stepped away, hands visible and expressions carefully neutral. They'd contracted to retrieve a woman, not to die in a Wyoming valley for a man whose arrogance had led them into an impossible situation. "Smart choice," Bo said, emerging from cover with his rifle still ready, but no longer aggressively aimed. "You can ride out of here and find employment with someone who won't get you killed through poor planning." The mercenaries needed no further encouragement. Within minutes they were mounted and riding away, leaving Marcus alone and defenseless in the middle of a valley where his money and connections meant nothing. But Marcus Whitfield was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. As Bo approached, the businessman's hand moved toward his coat with desperate speed, revealing a hidden derringer similar to Rose's but deadlier in its intent. "If I can't have her, then no one can," Marcus snarled, raising the small weapon toward the cabin where Rose watched from the window. The shot that followed was not from Marcus's derringer. Rose had seen the threat developing and acted with the quick reflexes of someone who learned to recognize danger in all its forms. Her own small pistol cracked once, and Marcus's weapon spun away from numbed fingers as her bullet found its mark. Marcus staggered backward, clutching his wounded hand and staring at Rose with the shocked expression of a man who'd never imagined his victim might fight back effectively. "You shot me," he said, as if the concept was beyond his comprehension. "I defended myself," Rose replied calmly, appearing in the cabin doorway with her pistol still ready. "Just like you taught me to do when you explained what would happen if I ever tried to leave you." Bo reached Marcus just as the man was fumbling for something else in his coat, not another weapon, but a leather portfolio that contained documents Marcus clearly considered more valuable than his own safety. "Insurance," Marcus gasped, clutching the portfolio against his chest. "Correspondence with territorial officials, records of payments made, services rendered. You think you've won, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Kill me, and these documents will surface in ways that will destroy everyone involved." Bo studied the wounded man with the dispassionate assessment of someone who'd interrogated enemy agents during wartime. Marcus was playing his final card, hoping that the threat of broader exposure would save him from the consequences of his actions. "You're probably right," Bo said quietly. "Those documents would cause problems for a lot of people. The territorial, a governor, various judges and marshals, maybe even some folks back in Washington." Marcus's expression brightened with desperate hope. "Then you understand—" "I understand that you've just confessed to bribing public officials," Bo interrupted. "And I understand that those documents represent evidence of federal crimes that go far beyond your personal vendetta against Rose." The hope died in Marcus's eyes as he realized his mistake. In his desperation to save himself, he'd revealed the existence of evidence that would make him even more dangerous to leave alive. Federal investigators would want those documents, and they wouldn't much care what happened to Marcus in the process of obtaining them. "You can't prove anything," Marcus said weakly. "I don't have to," Bo replied. "Rose heard your confession, Tom heard it, and the other men heard it. When Marshal Hawkins gets word about what happened here today, he'll be very interested in examining that portfolio you're so concerned about protecting." Rose approached carefully, her pistol still ready, but her expression more sad than angry. "It's over, Marcus. All of it. The threats, the control, the fear. I'm not your property, and I never was." Marcus looked up at her with the confused expression of a man whose entire world view had just collapsed. He'd built his life around the principle that money and position could overcome any obstacle. That power gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. The possibility that his victims might refuse to remain victims simply hadn't occurred to him. "You don't understand," he said plaintively. "I love you. Everything I did was because I love you." "No," Rose said firmly. "Love doesn't use fear as a weapon. Love doesn't try to own or control. What you felt was possession, not love. And the difference between those things is everything." Marshal Hawkins arrived 2 hours later, having ridden hard after receiving word of the confrontation. He found Marcus Whitfield bound and under guard, his mercenaries long gone, and a collection of evidence that would keep federal prosecutors busy for months. "Major Carter," Hawkins said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure about Bo's actual rank or authority. "This is quite a mess you've created here." "Sometimes messes are necessary to clean up bigger problems," Bo replied, handing over Marcus's portfolio. "You'll find that Mr. Whitfield has been very cooperative in documenting his various criminal enterprises." Hawkins examined the documents with growing amazement. Names, dates, amounts. A comprehensive record of corruption that reached into every level of territorial government. "This is bigger than I imagined. We're going to need federal investigators, maybe a grand jury, whatever it takes," Bo said. "But I want your word that Miss Ellington will be protected throughout the process. She's been through enough." "You have it," Hawkins assured him. "And Major, whether your current authority is official or not, the territorial government owes you a debt. This kind of corruption destroys people's faith in justice itself." As Hawkins prepared to transport Marcus back to Cheyenne, the defeated man made one final attempt at negotiation. "You think this ends anything? I have friends, resources. This won't hold me for long." "Maybe not," Bo agreed. "But it'll hold you long enough for people to realize you're not untouchable. And once that word gets out, those friends of yours are going to be very interested in distancing themselves from a man who kept written records of their illegal activities." The truth of this observation was written in Marcus's expression as he finally understood the full scope of his defeat. By documenting his corruption so thoroughly, he'd created the instrument of his own destruction. His careful records would protect no one and implicate everyone. As the sound of departing horses faded into the distance, Bo and Rose stood together in their valley, looking out over land that had been baptized by conflict and emerged somehow more precious for having been defended. The old tomcat reappeared at the edge of the clearing, cautiously approaching his feeding spot as if testing whether the danger had truly passed. "Is it really over?" Rose asked, echoing the question that had haunted them for months. Bo considered the question carefully. Marcus was in custody, his mercenaries were gone, and his network of corruption was being exposed. But more importantly, Rose had found her voice and her strength, proving to herself and everyone else that she was no one's victim. "It's over," he said with conviction. "Whatever happens next, you're free. We're free." Rose reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of a scar he'd earned in service to his country years before he'd ever imagined serving something more personal and precious. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for protecting me, for showing me what it means to be strong enough to be gentle." "Thank you," Bo replied, "for coming back, for choosing this life, choosing me, choosing us." They kissed as the sun reached its zenith over the Wyoming mountains. Two people who'd fought for their right to love each other and won. Around them, the valley settled back into its natural rhythms, but something fundamental had changed. This was no longer just the place where they lived. It was the place they'd chosen to defend, the ground they'd claimed as their own through courage and commitment. The wooden rose still sat on the windowsill, catching the midday light and holding it like a promise fulfilled. 6 months later, the Wyoming Territory was painted in the golden hues of autumn, and the valley that had once echoed with gunfire now hummed with the quiet sounds of contentment. The cabin that had sheltered 2 broken souls through their darkest winter had been expanded into something that could truly be called a home, with the big windows Bo had dreamed of and a kitchen where Rose could practice the art of cooking without setting anything on fire. The trial of Marcus Whitfield had concluded 3 weeks earlier, resulting in a sentence that would keep him in federal prison for the better part of a decade. The corruption investigation his documents had triggered had swept through territorial government like a cleansing fire, removing officials who'd forgotten that public service meant serving the public rather than enriching themselves. Marshal Hawkins had visited twice during the legal proceedings, each time expressing his gratitude for Bo's role in exposing the corruption network. On his final visit, he'd brought an official commendation from the territorial governor and an offer of employment that Bo had politely declined. "I've got all the work I can handle right here," Bo had explained, gesturing toward the workshop. He'd built adjacent to the cabin. The workshop was Rose's idea, a place where Bo could pursue his wood carving with the seriousness it deserved. Word of his artistic talents had spread beyond Wyoming Territory, carried by travelers who'd seen his work displayed in Mrs. Henderson's shop in Cheyenne. Orders now arrived regularly by mail, keeping Bo busy creating everything from decorative household items to custom furniture pieces that bore his distinctive style. But it was the afternoon visitors who brought Bo the deepest satisfaction. Young men and a few women, most of them veterans of various conflicts, made their way to the valley seeking the kind of healing that couldn't be found in hospitals or churches. They came carrying the invisible wounds that society preferred to ignore, and they left with tools for managing pain that went deeper than flesh. Tom Morrison had been the first to suggest that Bo formalize his approach to helping traumatized souls. "What you taught me saved my life," Tom had said during one of his regular visits. "There are others who need the same kind of help, and you're the only one I know who understands how to provide it." The program that emerged was simple but effective. Visitors spent a week in the valley, learning basic woodworking skills while talking through their experiences with someone who understood the weight of carrying ghosts. The combination of creative work and careful conversation seemed to unlock healing pathways that traditional approaches had missed. Rose proved to be an essential partner in this endeavor, providing the domestic stability and emotional support that made visitors feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Her own journey from victim to survivor resonated with people who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control, showing them that strength could emerge from the most unlikely places. "You know what I think?" Rose said one evening as they watched their latest group of visitors work around the evening fire, carving small projects while sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. "What's that?" Bo asked, pausing in his own carving, a wedding gift he was creating in secret. "I think we were meant to find each other, not just because we fell in love, but because together we can do something neither of us could accomplish alone." Bo considered this, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight. Former soldiers learning to transform their pain into beauty. A young woman who'd survived assault, discovering her own capacity for strength. An older man processing the loss of his son in an industrial accident. Each person carried their own burden, but none of them carried it alone anymore. "Maybe you're right," Bo agreed. "Maybe that's what love really is. Not just finding someone who completes you, but finding someone who helps you become the person you were meant to be." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the aspens painting the mountainsides in brilliant gold. The ceremony was simple, conducted by the territorial judge, who'd presided over Marcus Whitfield's trial and who'd made the journey specifically to perform this service. The guest list included everyone who'd stood with them during their darkest hours. The Morrisons, Marshall Hawkins, Mrs. Henderson from Cheyenne, and a dozen others who'd become part of their extended family. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her changed circumstances, but retaining the elegant simplicity that had made it special. Bo wore his dress uniform for the first time in years, the blue wool perfectly pressed and the brass buttons gleaming in the autumn sunlight. But it was the rings that carried the deepest meaning. Bo had carved them himself from a piece of oak that had weathered countless Wyoming storms, the simple bands smooth as silk and warm to the touch. As they exchanged vows, Rose felt the weight of her mother's recipe book in her pocket, while Bo carried his father's pocket watch, symbols of the families they'd lost and the family they were creating together. Do you, Robert James Carter, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do, Bo said, his voice carrying across the valley like a promise that would outlast the mountains themselves. Do you, Rose Catherine Ellington, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do, Rose replied, tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke the words that made official what had been true in her heart for months. The celebration that followed was everything a proper wedding should be, filled with music, laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing two people choose each other completely. Tom Morrison surprised everyone by producing a fiddle and leading an impromptu dance that continued until the stars came out over the valley. As the last guests departed and quiet settled over their home, Bo and Rose stood together on the porch. They dreamed of looking out over land that had tested them and ultimately accepted them as part of its story. Any regrets? Bo asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. Only one, Rose replied, leaning against his warmth. I regret that it took me so long to realize that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build with someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. The old tomcat appeared at the edge of the porch, moving with the confidence of an animal that had finally learned to trust in the permanence of kindness. He settled into his favorite spot near the door, a battle-scarred survivor who'd found his own version of sanctuary. Look at that, Rose laughed, pointing toward the cat. Even he approves. Bo pulled his wife closer, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd both come to this valley carrying wounds that seemed too deep to heal, convinced that they were too damaged for anything approaching happiness. But love, they discovered, wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone whose imperfections complemented your own, someone who would stand with you while you both became the people you were meant to be. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing the small victories of two souls who'd found their way home to each other. The wooden rose still sat on the windowsill inside, no longer a symbol of hope deferred, but of love declared and defended. In the distance, a night bird called from the aspens, its song carrying across the valley like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking healing, new opportunities to build something lasting and good. But tonight, in this moment, Bo and Rose Carter had everything they'd ever dared to dream of, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than steel, a home built on foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose, and a future bright with possibilities they were brave enough to embrace together. The valley settled into sleep around them, blessed by the presence of two people who'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the harshest soil, tended by hands that refused to give up on the promise of spring.